Stop! Will you tell these fools I'm not crazy? Make them listen to me before it's too late! Listen to me. Please listen. If you don't, if you won't, if you fail to understand, then the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
Scott, have you seen Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
I have seen the remake from the 1970s, but I have not seen the original 1956 version directed by Don Siegel.
Oh, well, you've got to see it. It's iconic. It's one of the classic American sci-fi films from the 50s and 60s.
And for what I understand, it's like part of the era, the 1950s. It's of the time.
Yeah, it very much is because first of all, it's a great, just sci-fi film about an evil alien invasion. Most alien invasion movies, the aliens are bad. But it also reflects very much the period of time that it was made in the 1950s. It's kind of paranoid. It's about a fear of the other. The aliens, what they are is they duplicate. They look just like humans. So here you are, and you see another human being who looks just like another person from your little town, and it's like, are they themselves or are they an alien? And of course, it reflected. It's interesting because this fear of being different, everything wanting to be the same. Some people have interpreted Invasion of the Body Snatchers as being about the repressiveness of the 1950s and the conservatism and forcing everyone to be the same. And it's like they're controlling our minds and we aren't free. But other people have interpreted it as saying, no, it's about communism.
The body snatchers are the communists.
They're the communists going to take us over, which fits with the 1950s. And I believe that Don Siegel, the director, was very cagey about that. He just was, no, it's not political, which is not true. It obviously is political, but in which way? I don't know. To me, it's both, right?
And it fits, and it's also within that body of work in terms of the 1950s science fiction movies, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Them, Forbidden Planet. We can talk about these, but let's go backwards to the first really great science fiction movie from 1903. It's from France, from Georges Méliès, A Trip to the Moon.
Right. It's the most famous film from one of the most important pioneers of filmmaking. He was one of the very first. So this is going back to when movies first started. And he made this movie that was just a classic sci-fi story. It had already been done in writing in the 19th century by writers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And it's just some scientists build a rocket, fly to the moon. They encounter aliens. They encounter all kinds of weird plants and animals because we didn't know what the moon was actually like. And they encounter aliens who are attacking them, and they fight them off, capture one, and bring it back to Earth. But it also, the other important thing to say about it is Georges Méliès invented special effects, right? Stop motion photography, animation, all kinds of interesting special effects.
Using set design as a special effect even.
Absolutely, because he never moved his camera around or anything. It was all done on a stage. But it's interesting that it's appropriate that really the person who made the first true science fiction film also did it with special effects, which are so central to the medium now.
And then that was followed by some silence, movies like the original Frankenstein from 1910, adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1916, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne, 1925. But then in 1927, Fritz Lang makes Metropolis in Germany. Is it arguably the first robot?
Yeah, and the movies you just mentioned are all pretty forgettable. So not much happens between A Trip to the Moon in 1903 and then Metropolis in 1927. It's about robots that, again, look like people. One in particular who is, planted there by the owners of the businesses to get the workers to revolt so they can have an excuse to kill them off. It has amazing special effects for the time, and it is about robots and the future, and so it's a great science fiction film near the end of the silent era. But it's German. There isn't much happening in the United States until later.
Yeah, well, actually just 4 years later, in 1931, when James Whale makes the Frankenstein.
Universal Studios, Universal Pictures was one of the little three. You know, get a little Hollywood studio history here. The big ones were MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and a couple others. Universal was kind of small, but they struck gold when they made Frankenstein, and then in the same year they made Dracula. And then they went on to make all these ones that you know well. They're household names. The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Wolf Man. And these all became franchises with many, many repeats. But they really, even though Frankenstein truly is science fiction, because it is not magic or anything like that, or it's a scientist in a lab uses scientists to create a being, right? It's science. But the movie, it was the monster and the monstrousness that caught people's attention, and that's why it really gave birth to the horror genre that Universal Pictures was behind. So we have to go later to find true science fiction.
And in the 1940s, there wasn't a lot of activity. Of course, World War II was happening. And then in the 1950s, it's really the golden age of classic Hollywood sci-fi. Beginning in 1951 with The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise.
We have an organization for the mutual protection of all planets and for the complete elimination of aggression. The test of any such higher authority is, of course, the police force that supports it. For our policemen, we created a race of robots. Their function is to patrol the planets in spaceships like this one and preserve the peace.
That's a wonderful film. That one's actually about good aliens who come to Earth to, again, movies, particularly I think science fiction type movies, often capture what's going on in the world at the time. And one of the things that make up sci-fi films of the time is fear of like nuclear annihilation. So these aliens come to Earth, stop everything, the Earth stands still, and basically get us to like own up and act correctly so we don't destroy ourselves by nuclear war.
And it was remade into a movie that's very forgettable in 2008, where they, instead of nuclear war, it's environmentalism. It's global warming and climate change that the alien is warning us about.
Right. So even if the movie's forgettable, it shows you how science fiction movies are. They look at what's going on in the world in terms of our science and our planet and our politics, and they address that and then speculate about what could happen in the future.
And then in 1956, we have Forbidden Planet, directed by Fred Wilcox, which is based on Shakespeare's The Tempest. It's a precursor to Star Trek, and it's also a big Hollywood production.
Because most, we haven't mentioned this yet, but most science fiction, the reason why there are hardly any in the 30s and 40s and stuff, it wasn't thought well of as a genre, right? And it was from Pulp Fiction, and no one thought much of it. And even in the 50s and 60s, most science fiction are B films. But you're saying Forbidden Planet was an A picture.
It was an A picture. It had in terms of the marketing and the money for the special effects, and you can see it even today. Watching it, Technicolor, it looks gorgeous.
Prepare your minds for a new scale of physical scientific values, gentlemen.
And I always remember this thing he shows him. It's like stories deep. It's like 100 stories tall. It's actually deep into the earth, and it's all the knowledge of in history, like collected as data. It's kind of like a 1950s version of what we must imagine like a Google server farm looks like, right? That was kind of fortuitous. And then the same year, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which we started off with. And then in 1960, The Time Machine, based on the book by H.G. Wells, directed by George Pal with Rod Taylor. And this is a movie both you and I grew up watching like over and over on television, I'm sure. Yeah, it's so entertaining and probably an A picture. It had a big cast and George Pal's effects and everything. But it's also, you know, H.G. Wells translated perfectly. If you look at what H.G. Wells wrote, they're still the major themes of science fiction movies now, right? The Time Machine is about time travel. And it's a warning to what we could do if we don't do things right. War of the Worlds is about alien invasion. And then you've got The Invisible Man, which is, you know, about a scientist, you know, the mad scientist. And he's got it all. So those made great movies. Even, of course, those have all been remade, right? Time Machine, War of the Worlds. There's the Tom Cruise version of War of the Worlds. And another one that I think, as we get later in the 60s and we start to approach the end of what I think we would call the classic era of sci-fi, the great French New Wave film director Francois Truffaut made this film in English called Fahrenheit 451, which is the Ray Bradbury novel. But that's very important because it's about a future where they burn books and people's ability to learn and be smart is suppressed. And it's dystopian science fiction. If you look at TV series and movies now, they're virtually, especially TV series, they're like all dystopian, futuristic sci-fi now.
It's the dark vision.
Yeah.
As opposed to the optimistic vision.
Right.
And then at the end of the decade, 2001, which one could say is the culmination of classic science fiction and the beginning of contemporary science fiction.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it the culmination. It was such a huge paradigm shift that it basically said, forget all this way of doing science fiction in movies. Here's the new way. And it changed everything.